The waves of the ocean have long been the stage for fiery, aggressive commanders who captured the public imagination with bold charges and dramatic declarations. In the grand theater of naval warfare, history often remembers those who shouted the loudest, those who wore their arrogance like armor, and those who rushed headlong into the smoke of battle. Yet, in June 1942, when the entire future of the Pacific theater and the global balance of power hung by a single, fragile thread, the United States did not need a roaring lion. It did not need a reckless gambler who would risk everything on a whim. Instead, it needed a cool, calculating, and ruthlessly logical mind. It needed a leader who could look at a map of a vast, unforgiving ocean and see it not as a battlefield of glory, but as a complex chessboard of mathematical probabilities. That mind belonged to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, known to his contemporaries and to history as the Quiet Warrior. Spruance was a man who actively shunned the media spotlight, never celebrated his victories publicly, and broke the spine of the enemy fleet through sheer intellectual precision. The Battle of Midway was his first major naval engagement as a carrier task force commander, a monumental responsibility thrust upon him suddenly when the legendary and charismatic Admiral Bull Halsey fell ill with a severe skin condition just days before the fleet was set to sail. Spruance, originally a cruiser commander with absolutely no practical experience in directing carrier-based aviation warfare, found himself standing on the flag bridge of the USS Enterprise, facing the most formidable naval force on the planet. The Imperial Japanese Navy was riding a wave of unbroken triumphs, their pride and joy. The first mobile fleet, known globally as the Kido Beauty, was advancing toward a tiny coral atoll named Midway Island. This fleet was anchored by 4 veteran fleet aircraft carriers that had previously devastated Pearl Harbor, swept through the Indian Ocean, and struck terror into the hearts of the Allied nations. Taking command of Task Force 16, which included the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Hornet, Spruance refused to let emotion or the crushing weight of the situation cloud his judgment. He was a man of strict routine, known for taking long walks on the deck to clear his mind, and he approached the upcoming clash with the cold detachment of a scientist. His greatest asset in this asymmetric conflict was not just the steel of his ships or the courage of his pilots, but the invisible weapon of intelligence. American codebreakers, working tirelessly in subterranean bunkers, had cracked the complex Japanese naval code known as JN-25. Because of this monumental breakthrough, Spruance knew the enemy's location, their intended target, and their approximate timeline. However, knowing the enemy's location was only half the battle. Striking them at the exact right moment required absolute tactical mastery and a flawless sense of timing. On the fateful morning of June 4, 1942, the opening moves of the battle began to unfold. Japanese aircraft had launched a massive strike to bombard Midway Island, and they were now returning to their carriers to refuel and rearm. At this critical juncture, Spruance faced a dilemma that would define his legacy. His staff officers, looking at the distance charts, urgently advised waiting until the enemy fleet closed the distance. They argued that waiting would guarantee a high probability strike, reduce navigation errors, and ensure that the American planes had enough fuel to return safely to their decks. Spruance, however, looked beyond the immediate horizon and calculated the hidden variables. He realized that if he waited for the ideal distance, the Japanese would have ample time to recover their planes, refuel them, rearm them, and launch a massive, coordinated counterstrike that could wipe the American carriers from the face of the earth. He chose to launch his aircraft immediately, at the absolute maximum range of his Douglas TBD Devastators and Curtiss SBC, deliberately accepting the calculated risk that many of his brave pilots might run out of fuel and crash into the cold Pacific waters on their return journey. This decision, born out of cold mathematical necessity rather than reckless bravery, proved to be the pivotal turning point of the Second World War. When the American Dauntless dive bombers finally arrived over the coordinates of the Japanese fleet, they caught the enemy in a moment of utter chaos and extreme vulnerability. The decks of the Japanese carriers Akagi and Soryu were cluttered with fueled aircraft, unsecured high-explosive bombs, and detached torpedoes, all due to Admiral Nagumo's frantic, shifting orders as he tried to respond to unexpected American threats. Within a terrifying span of just 5 minutes, American dive bombers, screaming down from the clouds, turned 3 flagship carriers into roaring, unstoppable infernos. Later that afternoon, Spruance's focused forces tracked down and destroyed the 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, effectively erasing the offensive core of the Kido Butai. However, the true masterclass in tactical discipline occurred after the smoke began to clear and the 4 Japanese carriers were sinking into the abyss. With the surviving elements of the Japanese fleet retreating westward, aggressive staff officers and senior commanders urged Spruance to pursue the remaining enemy surface vessels into the dark. They argued that a relentless pursuit would maximize the victory and allow them to destroy the rest of the Imperial Navy for an ordinary commander. The pursuit offered a golden chance at historic glory and front-page headlines. For Spruance, it was a tactical trap. He flatly refused to give chase into the gathering darkness, ordering his task force to turn back east instead. His staff was absolutely stunned by the order, with some even whispering bitter accusations of timidity and overcaution behind his back. Spruance, however, remained completely unmoved by the criticism. He knew that the Japanese Navy excelled in night surface combat, having trained extensively for nocturnal engagements, and he was well aware that they still possessed powerful battleships, including the monstrous Yamato, which could easily annihilate his lightly armored carriers in a close-range night engagement where planes could not fly. Post-war analysis and captured documents later confirmed his profound genius. Admiral Yamamoto was indeed rushing forward into the night with a heavy surface fleet, hoping to lure the American carriers into a trap where their air power would be rendered useless. By resisting the intoxicating temptation of personal glory and maintaining a firm grip on his operational objective, Spruance saved his carriers and secured a decisive victory that permanently broke the offensive capability of the Japanese Empire. Midway was won not just by pilot bravery, but by a commander who valued calculating intellect over reckless aggression. 2 long years after the miracle at Midway, in June 1944, Raymond Spruance was given command of the 5th Fleet, which had grown into the most powerful, technologically advanced armada ever assembled in the history of naval warfare. The United States now held the industrial, material, and numerical upper hand in the war. But the Japanese military, growing desperate as the Americans closed in on their homeland, was prepared to gamble everything on a final, apocalyptic showdown. The stage was set during the massive American amphibious invasion of the Marianas Islands, an operation designed to capture islands that would allow American B-29 bombers to strike Tokyo directly. This critical invasion led directly to the largest carrier clash in world history. Known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese military committed their entire remaining carrier strength, 9 carriers in total, under the strategic command of Vice Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa. Ozawa's strategy was highly sophisticated and relied on the superior range of his scout and strike aircraft, combined with the logistical assistance of land-based planes situated on nearby islands. This allowed the Japanese to launch devastating strikes from a massive distance, far beyond the reach of American carrier planes. Ozawa fully intended to sweep the American fleet aside, cut off all lines of communication, and completely isolate the vulnerable U.S. troops currently fighting on the bloody beaches of Saipan. Spruance once again found himself standing at a profound strategic crossroads, facing intense pressure from his own ranks. His aggressive and highly capable carrier commander, Admiral Mark Mitchell, repeatedly urged Spruance to sail the fleet westward into the open ocean to hunt down the Japanese carriers and seize the tactical initiative. Mitchell, a traditional aviator, believed firmly that the primary and absolute duty of a carrier fleet was to seek out and destroy the enemy's capital ships at all costs. Spruance, however, refused to be swayed by traditional doctrine and remained firmly anchored to the bigger strategic picture. He understood that his primary mission was not to hunt carriers for the sake of glory, but to protect the thousands of vulnerable amphibious landing forces, engineers, and supply ships currently sitting on the shore at Saipan. He deduced through careful analysis that if he allowed Mitchell to chase the Japanese fleet too far to the west, a separate, hidden Japanese surface force could easily slip behind the American carriers and massacre the undefended troop transports on the island, effectively ruining the entire invasion. Despite intense, almost insubordinate pressure from his carrier commanders, Spruance refused to move his fleet out of protective range, choosing to maintain a strictly defensive posture. This disciplined, unyielding stance forced the Japanese to fly their aircraft across a massive, prepared wall of American defenses, resulting in the aerial slaughter known historically as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Advanced American radar systems detected the incoming Japanese waves long before they reached the fleet. American Hellcat fighters, guided by expert fighter directors, intercepted the enemy formations, while advanced anti-aircraft systems filled the sky with deadly flak. In a single devastating day of combat, Japan lost over 400 aircraft and the vast majority of its remaining trained, irreplaceable pilots. It was a staggering blow from which their naval air arm would never recover for the rest of the war. The very next day, once the safety of the beachhead was fully secured, American planes pursued the retreating, broken enemy fleet and sank several key carriers, leaving the surviving Japanese ships entirely toothless and unable to wage effective war. In the immediate aftermath of this monumental victory, Spruance faced a harsh wave of criticism from naval theorists, aggressive officers, and armchair generals who claimed that a bolder, more aggressive commander could have annihilated the entire Japanese fleet in a single blow. They called his caution a missed opportunity and labeled him a defensive-minded manager rather than a true warrior. Yet, history has vindicated Spruance completely. Had he fallen for the Japanese bait and abandoned the beachhead, the invasion of Saipan could have ended in a catastrophic disaster that would have delayed the end of the war by months or even years. Spruance understood a fundamental truth of warfare that many commanders forget in the heat of battle. A leader must never abandon the primary strategic objective for the sake of tactical glory. His calculated discipline stood in stark contrast to Admiral Halsey's later actions at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where Halsey took the bait, left the landing beaches completely unprotected, and nearly allowed the Japanese to destroy the entire invasion force. Raymond Spruance's tactical legacy proves that true military brilliance lies not in theatrical displays of anger or reckless bravery, but in emotional restraint, absolute strategic clarity, and the rare courage to remain quiet and disciplined in the face of immense pressure. To fully understand the depth of Spruance's operational mastery, one must look at how his decisions during these two monumental battles reshaped the entire trajectory of global history. In an era dominated by technological transitions, where the battleship was stubbornly giving way to the aircraft carrier, Spruance managed to synthesize old-school fleet logistics with the chaotic realities of modern aerial warfare. He was not a pilot himself, yet he possessed a profound, intuitive grasp of aviation limitations, weather patterns, wind directions, and fuel consumption rates. At Midway, his decision to launch early was not a wild guess. It was a cold assessment of time, distance, and human psychology. He knew that the human mind, when pressed under the clock of an impending rearmament process, becomes chaotic. He weaponized that chaos against Admiral Nagumo by forcing the Japanese fleet to defend itself while in the middle of switching weapons from land attack bombs to anti-ship torpedoes. He turned the enemy's own ammunition into the primary instrument of their destruction. Furthermore, Spruance's absolute refusal to be baited into nocturnal engagements demonstrated a level of ego control that is exceptionally rare among military elites. Most commanders are driven by an innate desire for complete annihilation of the enemy, a drive that frequently leads to overextension and disaster. Spruance recognized that in the grand strategic balance of 1942, the United States could not afford to lose a single aircraft carrier, whereas Japan could not easily replace theirs. His preservation of Task Force 16 was just as vital as his destruction of the Kido Butai by turning back eastward. He ensured that the fruits of the morning's historic victory were not thrown away in a reckless nighttime surface melee against Japanese battleships that outgunned him. This was the hallmark of a corporate manager mixed with a cold legit, a combination that proved far deadlier to the Japanese Empire than any flashy naval charge ever could. Exact same theme of supreme emotional regulation and strategic prioritization re-emerged with even greater consequence at the Philippine Sea in 1944. By this stage of the war, the pressures on Spruance had shifted from survival to execution. He was handed an instrument of absolute destruction in the form of the fast carrier task force. Yet he chose to use it as a shield rather than a sword. This decision infuriated his subordinates, who longed for a repeat of Midway, a clean sweeping of the seas. They viewed his refusal to sail west as an insult to American naval power. But Spruance understood that warfare is fundamentally about geography and objectives, not body counts or ship tallies. The objective was Saipan. The island was the key to unlocking the Japanese homeland. If the transport ships were destroyed, the thousands of Marines on the island would starve, the tanks would run out of fuel, and the entire momentum of the Central Pacific Drive would grind to a devastating halt by remaining anchored to the island. Spruance forced the enemy to come to him on his own terms. He transformed the space between the Japanese fleet and the Marianas into a giant meat grinder. The Japanese pilots, forced to fly at the absolute limits of their fuel ranges, arrived over the American fleet exhausted, uncoordinated, and completely exposed to the radar-directed fury of the Hellcats and proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. The resulting destruction of the Japanese naval air arm was so absolute that it effectively rendered their remaining aircraft carriers useless for the rest of the conflict, turning them into mere decoys. Spruance achieved the complete neutralization of the enemy's naval power by fighting a purely defensive battle, proving that offense and defense are merely two sides of the same strategic coin. When history weighs the contributions of the great naval commanders of the 20th century, Raymond Spruance stands out precisely because he left no dramatic quotes, no colorful anecdotes, and no legacy of reckless bravado. He did not seek the adulation of the public or the favor of politicians. When the war ended, he quietly stepped away from the spotlight, letting others write the memoirs and claim the public applause. But within the quiet halls of military academies and among serious strategists, his maneuvers are studied as the ultimate textbook examples of operational art. He proved that the highest form of tactical genius is not the ability to court danger and survive through luck, but the ability to eliminate luck altogether through rigorous calculation, disciplined adherence to the objective, and the profound courage to remain completely calm while the world burns around you.